Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 92, Gediminas, Ozbek and Ivan. Ivan the First Kalita of Moscow, Gediminas of Lithuania, and Khan Ozbek of the Horde all died within a few months of each other across 1340 to 1341. Each of them is seen in the historiography as a transformative figure, shaping the long-term development of their domains, as we've heard over the last few episodes. Gediminas is the most obviously successful of the three. Succeeding to a still unstable Lithuania that was only a step away from a tribal confederacy, he left behind a consolidated Grand Duchy, expanding into an empire, vastly bigger and more populous, although it was still fragile and contested. He established an enduring dynasty, and the new institutional maturity of Lithuania was embodied in the establishment of Vilnius as a permanent capital and seat of a centralized administration. He consolidated the personal authority of the Grand Duke over the old tribal nobility, effectively transforming it into a monarchy and the bedrock of Lithuanian military and political power. As what Lithuanian historian Edvardas Gudavičius calls a warrior state, whose existence relied on securing resources and power through military action, Gediminas was largely successful in resisting the Teutonic Order's expansionism and in extending Lithuanian rule or influence into the Rus Kняжество. In the east, while, as discussed previously, more recent historiography rejects the old narratives of peaceful expansion, in the lands that came under Lithuanian rule, he established a model of governance that was less institutionally intrusive than Mongol or Muscovite rule, and vastly preferable to the Teutonic Order's genocidal assimilationist approach. It was based on pragmatic tolerance of local laws, language, and religion. This policy facilitated the buy-in of Ruthenian elites, who retained their own status and gained the added protection of the Lithuanian military. Where Lithuania did not establish direct overlordship, Gediminas dramatically expanded Lithuanian influence. While avoiding formal submission, Smolensk effectively recognized the Grand Duchy's dominance and became a buffer between it and the rising power of Moscow. And although it was not successful in the long term, Gediminas also entered into an alliance with Tver against Moscow. He married his daughter, Anastasia, to Fyodor of Tver, and offered military protection in exchange for acknowledgement of Lithuanian influence. The Lithuanian expansion south brought them control over the Dnieper trade route, and looking to extend this control to the Volga and Novgorod-Baltic corridors was a logical development. Tver was a step towards the Volga, and Gediminas extended his influence in Novgorod through the election of his son, Narimantas, as the Knyaz of Pskov, providing military protection against the Teutonic Order and buying boyar support. Gediminas matched his military accomplishments with remarkable diplomatic successes for the ruler of a new state with few friends. He wrote to the Pope and other European leaders, arguing that the Teutonic Knights were aggressors, not defenders of the faith, and undermining the Northern Crusade, eventually leading to the withdrawal of papal support. Ambiguous and conditional promises of conversion were used to gain the support of the Church, with the resulting visit of papal legates to Vilnius, legitimizing the Grand Duchy in the eyes of the Catholic world, even while no conversion materialized for the time being. Strategic dynastic marriages with Casimir III of Poland and the ruling family of Mazovia secured Lithuania's southern flank and brought new allies against the Teutonic Order. Gediminas' diplomatic efforts also extended to the east. Building on earlier moves by Galicia and his brother, he secured the creation of an Orthodox Metropolitanate of Lithuania. As ever larger territories populated by Orthodox Slavs came under Lithuanian control, it became problematic that they were ecclesiastically subordinate to the Metropolitan of Kiev, who, as we know, had moved to Vladimir and then to Lithuania's main political rival, Moscow. This placed Lithuania between the expansionist Latin Church, both the Order's military campaigns and the political pressure to convert from the Pope and potential Western allies, and the potential for Muscovy to try to make orthodoxy a political lever inside Lithuania. The details of the see's creation are unknown, but the records of the Patriarchate of Constantinople show that it existed, with a hierarch named either Kirill or Theophilus, by the time of a synod in August 1317. Lithuanian historians assume that this was the outcome of negotiations in which Gediminas promised to remain under Constantinople's canonical authority and probably promised Lithuanian conversion in exchange for ecclesiastical independence from Moscow. Rather than Vilnius, the metropolitan was based in Novhrudak, now Gardukas in Lithuanian, in Black Ruthenia, the Ruthenian land that the Lithuanians had ruled for longest, in the center of its Orthodox population. This made it easier for Gediminas to claim the Metropolitanate was continuing the old Kievan tradition within the new political framework, and to present himself as the defender of orthodoxy, while maintaining the pagan character of the Lithuanian heartland. Lithuanian historians see three motives behind Gediminas' support for the Lithuanian Metropolitanate: consolidating his authority in a multi-confessional state, countering the rise of Moscow, and balancing his diplomatic efforts towards Rome. Having his own metropolitan was clearly a way to gain Ruthenian loyalty and develop a political community within the Grand Duchy. Second, although Moscow had yet to explicitly declare any ambition to gather the Rus, and any attempt to do so would have been well beyond its means at this time, the Church, with its leader in Moscow, did declare the spiritual unity of the Orthodox Eastern Slavs. So the idea of mobilizing Orthodox solidarity against a pagan ruler was not too far-fetched. It was obviously desirable for Gediminas to undermine this. Lithuanian historians also take the Metropolitanate, together with Gediminas' letters to the Pope, the Hanseatic cities of the Baltic, and other Western leaders, offering recognition and tolerance to Catholics, as evidence that he was attempting to create a polycentric, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional empire. The appearance of the Lithuanian Metropolitanate provoked sustained opposition from the Metropolitan of Moscow, especially Fyodnas. Muscovite delegations to Constantinople argued that the see violated the spiritual unity of the Kievan Metropolitanate, and that there were too few actually Lithuanian Orthodox believers to justify it. After around a decade of negotiations, the Patriarchate gave in, and the Metropolitanate of Lithuania was suppressed. To Lithuanian historians, these canonical arguments were a veneer over Moscow's true geopolitical objectives. The ecclesiastical defeat for Gediminas boosted Moscow's vision of itself as the leader of the Rus, and the idea of its mission to transform ecclesiastical control into political. Despite the negative outcome, Gediminas' diplomatic activities throughout his reign elevate him above the idea of a barbarian pagan warlord. He clearly more than held his own among his contemporaries. Gediminas most likely died while leading a siege against the Teutonic Order. He left 7 sons, and, initially, his realm was apportioned among them, according to the old traditions of inheritance. However, Algirdas and Kęstutis, acting as a diarchy, swiftly reunited and re-centralized the Grand Duchy, demonstrating the robustness of the institutions that Gediminas had created. This, in the judgment of historians, made Gediminas the founding statesman of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the dynasty that bore his name. We've already heard how Khan Ozbek reformed Mongol rule of the northeastern Kняжества and placed his trust in Ivan Kalita as Grand Knyaz and chief tax-gatherer, and about his decision to make Islam the official religion of the Horde, a decision with immense long-term repercussions. But he was no less active in foreign policy. From the beginning, Ozbek faced the same problem that Batu, Berke, and Möngke Timur had all faced. The Horde was sharing the Caucasus with the Ilkhanids, and neither of them was happy about it. The war was over, and Ozbek generally tried to extend his rule south to dominate the mountain passes by peaceful means. In around 1330, he married his son, Tinibek, to the daughter of an Ilkhanid emir. But he was not above trying a military attack, as he did in 1318 and 1335, when the Ilkhanids were dealing with succession crises. He kept the peace with the Toluids to promote east-west trade, and when the Chagatayeds tried to persuade him to join a campaign against the Yuan, he refused. In the west, Ozbek strengthened his relations with the Latin world by pardoning the Genoese that Toktua had expelled and allowing them to return and rebuild Kaffa. The Italians were offered the very best trade terms, provided they routed their shipments through Horde, not Ilkhanate territory. Kaffa quickly recovered, and soon the Franciscans were back as well. They returned to their previous positions, providing services to the court, and extended their missionary work as far as Siberia, where they claimed to be meeting with great success. The Khan allowed them to establish 10 convents. The Genoans had traditionally served as the Mongols' go-betweens with the Mamluks, and a merchant named Segurano Salvego became a kind of ambassador for Ozbek. In 1315, he surprised his master by returning with a proposal from Sultan al-Nasir Mohammed that the Khan give him a bride. After 3 years of negotiations, Salvego arrived in Alexandria with Tulanbay Khatun, presented as Ozbek's daughter, but more likely his niece, and her entourage of 3,000 servants. Despite the protracted negotiations, it turned out that both sides had fundamentally misunderstood what they were getting into. The Sultan thought that he had been raising his status as an ally of the Horde by marrying a Chinggisid princess. But the Mongols, as we've already seen, for example, with Chinggis Khan's own daughters, saw such marriages as rewards, securing the loyalty of trusted vassals. Ozbek demanded a huge bride price, which forced the Sultan to borrow from Mongol merchants, and almost immediately began demanding that the Sultan restart his war against the Ilkhanids. This the Sultan did not want to do. He was in the middle of peace negotiations that would end in a promising trade agreement, and a renewal of hostilities was the last thing he wanted. He even warned the Ilkhanids of the Horde's intent. Without his agreement, Ozbek was forced to abandon his plans. Furious, Ozbek banned the sale of slaves to the Mamluks and had Salvego tracked down and executed. Al-Nasir Mohammed divorced Tulanbay and passed her on to one of his emirs. Despite all this, the Mamluk slave trade was too lucrative for the Mongols and too vital for the Mamluks, and relations were not broken off entirely. Another tool Ozbek used against the Ilkhanids was the Eastern European grain market. The fact that the Mongols did not farm or eat much grain themselves made no difference to the western steppe remaining the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, as it had been since the Scythians. Byzantium was especially dependent on a stable supply. Ozbek demanded that Genoese and other merchants with access to the trade avoid doing business with the Ilkhanid. Failure to comply could result in death. There were carrots to go with the stick. In 1332, Venice sent its first ambassador to the Horde, looking for permission to build their own trading post like Kaffa. The Venetians had until then dealt with the Ilkhanids, but Genoa was out competing them on the Black Sea market. The following year, the Venetians took over a large part of the town of Azak, near the mouth of the Don, a harbour dating back to the days of the ancient Greek colonists. They named their quarter Tana, after the Greek word for the Don. The Venetians received considerable rights and privileges, as well as a guarantee that they would not be held liable for the debts of other Italians, something that had happened in the past. Ozbek hoped that increasing competition between the Italians would boost his profits, and it did. The agreement with Venice was renewed a further A growing economy drove an increasing population. Sarai was by now a city of around 75,000, where public works programs created sophisticated flood defences, sewage systems, and wells divided into those for drinking and those for other uses. They were built by engineers from Central Asia, where such systems had been commonplace for centuries. Sarai was an industrial centre as much as a marketplace. A diverse population from across the Mongols' conquered territories provided craftsmen and artisans of every type. But Ozbek wanted more to reflect his growing greatness and ordered the construction of Sarai al-Jadid, New Sarai, around 150 kilometers north along the Volga. Within a couple of decades, New Sarai had become an equally great city, although Old Sarai continued as the main city in the south. Ozbek invested heavily in building Muslim institutions, mosques, schools, and bathhouses, as well as restoring religious buildings in Central Asia that had fallen into disrepair. Visitors from the rest of the Muslim world were amazed to see so many mosques and schools in the cities they visited. Alongside this, he continued the Mongol tradition of tolerance, extending Tarkhan's status to elite Christians, including Mongols who were not ready to convert to Islam, and financing the construction of churches and monasteries as well. The spread of religious institutions further encouraged urbanization, as well as increasing the use of stone and brick buildings. But Mongol towns were still built without fortifications. Increasing urbanization and farming meant that the Mongols had to engage with a concept that had previously been alien to them: land ownership. Their traditional view was that the land belonged to the spirits. For their sedentary subjects, it belonged to whoever put up the fence. The Mongols usually respected local practices, especially for the well-established and numerous sedentary populations like the Rus, Volga Bulgars, and peoples of the Crimea. As long as they did not interfere with pasturage, they were free to continue according to their own customs. But now Tarkhans, especially religious institutions, extended land in ownership into the steppe. The Franciscans were almost as active as the Orthodox. Non-Tarkhan but wealthy individuals, including Mongols, could access their privileges by hosting religious communities on their land. Religious communities stimulated agriculture, and increasing agriculture attracted religious communities. Wealthy Mongols even sponsored the founding of monasteries in the Knyazhstva, especially around Rostov and Kostroma. The tax benefits that Tarkhans received for church building led to a boom in Russian cities. Soon Novgorod had over 80 churches. There was no overarching law to govern buying and selling land between the different communities. According to Marie Favron, despite the differences in tradition, they found common ground in shared ideas of communal ownership. Mongols saw their property as belonging to their wider lineage, while the Rus saw land as owned by extended families, not individuals. They could understand each other's positions well enough to respect each other's traditions and the rituals around sales. This development of private property ownership was yet another example of the adaptability of the Mongols, and encouraged urban and agrarian development across the region. By the end of Ozbek's reign, the horde was at its peak. It was politically stable, had strong relations with its neighbours, and was booming economically. The only thorn in his side was the Ilkhanate. In 1335, however, the ruler of the Ilkhanate, Abu Sa'id, died. He had several wives, at least one daughter, but no son and heir. There were no other descendants of Hulagu to contest the succession, so multiple candidates from secondary lines threw their hats in the ring. It was the first of the Mongol empires where pretenders from outside the Golden Family tried to claim the throne, and none of them could overcome the shortfall in legitimacy. To both Mongols and Muslims, the Ilkhanate had lost the mandate of heaven, and it began to break up. Ozbek died before the process was complete. The throne passed to his son, Janibek, who led an army south through Derbent and finally took Azerbaijan. Ivan Kalita rather pales against the background of Ozbek and Gediminas. As we've heard, his reputation as the initiator of Moscow's rise to greatness is largely retrospective and inflated, with little actual difference to be seen in the Kняжество between the beginning and end of his reign. But there was one significant event that we've not covered yet that was key to his subsequent reputation. As the end of his life approached, Ivan made a final journey to Sarai. The purpose of his visit was to obtain the Khan's approval for his will and to designate his son, Simeon the Proud, as heir to the title of Grand Knyaz of Vladimir. That is, Ivan aimed to radically overturn the rules of succession and to make the Mongol Yalik, establishing the preeminent Knyaz in the northeast, a hereditary possession of the Knyaz of Moscow, thereby ending the contesting of the title upon the death of the Grand Knyaz and its rotation among the houses as the Mongols played the Knyazes off against each other. Historians see the step as another example of Ivan's shrewd pragmatism and put his success, Ozbek agreed that Simeon would inherit his Yalik, down to Ivan's faithful and effective service to the Mongols. This well-established viewpoint is found among both imperialist historians and those less favourable to Moscow. However, more recent revisionists, such as Donald Ostrowski, have argued that the granting of the request was due at least as much to Ozbek's own pragmatism. As the Grand Duchy of Lithuania emerged as a potential threat in the West, it was strategically beneficial for Ozbek to have a strong and stable counterbalance in the form of Moscow. In this telling, backing Moscow's efforts to consolidate the Kняжество also served the Khan's interests. Ivan's move was undoubtedly successful. The Yalik passes to his son and then his grandson, and stays with Moscow thereafter, with only a brief interruption. But seeing it as the foundation of Moscow's smooth or inevitable rise to dominance is still a retrospective and anachronistic viewpoint. Moscow is still far from emerging as a real power. There are plenty of ways in which history could have turned out differently. This is the last episode of 2025. I'll be taking a break as usual, but there will still be members episodes coming out in December and January. We will pick up around the end of January for the final stretch of Season 1. Thank you all for listening, and have a great Christmas, New Year, and for all my fellow Southern Hemisphere residents, summer. Until next time, goodbye.